Hola, hola. Hola, hola.
Hola, hola. ¿Aló? Hola, hola. Aquí voy a llamar al funcionario. Si quieren, pueden ir a servirse cafecito, hay galletas por mientras. Vamos a empezar en, yo creo que 2 minutitos. ¿Sí? Así que sírvanse con ganas, no más problema. ¿9, 6, 8 y 17? ¿Y el código? Ah, ya. 933 69 63 68 17. ¿Ahí? Ya. El código es 369 323. Ah, ya. El tiene ¿repetiste lo que dice? Sí. Avísame cuando le haya dicho la persona. Voy a dar un código, tú pones. Yo creo que sí.
The slides.
It should be slides.
That's
For slides.
historic slides.
Yeah.
Is that one?
PDF? No,
But it's not PDF. It's
no,
not.
it's just a PDF.
Yeah.
Perfect. Sure.
Y lo voy a mandar a la persona. Al banco. ¿Al banco? A ver, el correo por mí. El correo por mí, ¿cuándo? Pueden acceder a la página web www.núcleohistoria. ¿Hay más información? Si me pueden acceder. 10.4 también.
give the slides, the top slides. So I don't know if you want to see this or
Can I ask you this, like, for slides?
maybe you can tell me no, but when I go next to the next slide and I can go down. Yeah.
It's only towards the end of the slide.
So
It's very disorganized, so I'll have to explain when we get to it.
hello. 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 Ahí. ¿Se escucha bien? ¿Sí? Bueno, muchas gracias. Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. El día de hoy iniciamos la última sesión del año del Núcleo de Historia Cultural, la cual corresponde a la presentación del libro Historia Fallida. Para ello, nos acompaña el autor del libro, a saber, el doctor en Historia de la Universidad de Turku, Kalle Pihlainen. Pihlainen es académico de las Universidades de Turku y Oulu, entre otras, además de coeditor de la revista Rethinking History, The Journal of Theory and Practice, la cual busca contribuir a repensar las fronteras y los paradigmas en la disciplina histórica. Su producción académica, la cual ha sido un aporte para la teoría cultural, y más específicamente para los campos de la teoría y filosofía de la historia, se focaliza en los debates éticos y políticos en torno a la representación histórica y los usos de la historia en contextos tanto académicos como populares. Entre sus obras se encuentran la obra de Historia, Constructivismo y Política del Estado, y más recientemente, Historia Fallida, ambas publicadas por la editorial chilena Palinor. Precisamente en este libro, que será presentado hoy, el historiador Kalle Pihlainen realiza una revisión crítica de aquellos errores habituales en la interpretación de la historia, que tergiversan nuestra relación con el pasado. En ese sentido, Pihlainen pone en tela de juicio las metáforas y analogías establecidas a partir de las cuales los historiadores piensan aquella relación, a la vez que propone focalizarse en las posibilidades críticas disponibles en los medios representacionales actuales, que permitan no perder de vista los compromisos profesionales de los historiadores. Como podrán haberse percatado, tienen a su disposición la traducción del paper de la presentación en formato físico, que está circulando por allí, la tienen a su disposición, y también en formato digital, tal como mencionó Tomás Cifuentes hace algunos minutos. ¿Sí? Bueno, sin más que añadir y agradeciendo nuevamente la asistencia, le cedo la palabra al historiador Kalle Pihlainen. Thank you very much again, Kalle. You can start your presentation.
For the organization and the invitation. I'm going to speak in English, obviously. Spanish is not very good. Can you hear me okay, or should I try and hold it? Yeah, okay. I will try and hold it properly. Very best, please. So the presentation, you have it, and I'm going to read it anyway, which I hope you won't find boring. I'll try and stick to the script because there's some things I want to get right more precisely. It's not directly about the book, which you introduced, Historia Fallida. It's what I would say is a broader take on the themes which inspired that book, which is very specific about certain problems in the way, as you explained already, in the way we speak about history, or we tend to speak about history on an everyday level. But in this paper, I'm trying to take a step back and then look at a broader issue in theory and philosophy of history, which is that a lot of important insights are about to be forgotten. So, but I will explain that if I make this much. Just read it. Thank you so much for such a wonderful opportunity, all the arrangements. So, given the extensive theoretical and philosophical debates about history over recent decades, coupled with a significant shift away from discussions centered on representation and the linguistic term, as well as the growing receptiveness to concepts like object-oriented ontology, new materialism, and the broad move towards reinvigorating empiricism, it appears most prudent to me to re-examine these theoretical discussions with a focus on some tangible examples in line with something of a practice-based approach. So I'm going to stick to it, but actually I have these little side notes here. So This relates in a way to a project we're doing with colleagues in education at the University of Turku, which is called Rethinking Historians' Expertise, or Rethinking Expertise in History. If anyone's interested in that sort of pedagogical interviews with historians and follow-ups on how history is being taught and so on, I recommend you go to that website. It should be, I think, findable, searchable with Rethinking Expertise in History. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out of that because collaborators there have interviewed, how many dozens of historians about their sort of unreflected beliefs about history, sort of very long, extensive interviews, and then conducting also questionnaires with students doing their MAs in history and becoming history teachers. So there's a lot of interesting material about unexpressed expectations, prejudices, and so on that hopefully will come up in the next few years in that project. But that's just an aside because I think the only way to be doing theory now is also to have some. We've been doing theory of history and philosophy of history for the last 30, 40 years, mostly making general claims about what it is historians do, and of course historians get upset when you tell them they're just objectivists, they're naive, and you don't have any evidence. So that's one way of approaching it. What I want to do here is look at texts from history texts, just a few examples. So, in this context, I aim to introduce what might be perceived as a contrasting perspective, emphasizing the importance of recognizing the value of existing tools and methodologies. I feel it crucial to moderate enthusiasm for constant innovation, utilizing these existing tools in nuanced and thoughtful ways instead. It seems important to acknowledge that not all concepts and methods need to be entirely rejected and then reimagined by each successive generation. This is something of a pet peeve of mine because in Rethinking History we get a lot of these submissions, but the authors just haven't read the tradition and they think they're doing something new and they present it under new terms. And I think it's part, I'm sure you're all about to discover or have discovered as part of the whole publishing industry at the moment and the academic industry, where you just have to produce, and it doesn't really matter what it is. If you're well aware of the tradition, you just have to produce as much as you can every year rather than writing one considered article. Actually doing the work, so we get a lot. Also in the journal, but also in the current discussions of theory and philosophy of history, I think there's a lot of reinvention going. The primary, I will stop complaining about things like that. The primary objective of my paper is to briefly revisit the generic commitments inherent in the field of history and to explore how these commitments are both established by the discipline and in turn how they shape it. My discussion will predominantly remain on a theoretical level, but also on one of textual analysis at the end, and I hope I'll make it more interesting. This is because I believe it's crucial to rehearse the ways in which genre commitments can be read back from the outputs of history, from history writing, and as we'll try, I think, a little bit from specific history texts. In this regard, I contend that recent theoretical and philosophical approaches to history have erred gravely by dismissing the textual issues related to historical meaning-making as being outdated or as some form of a misdirected narrativism. I put narrativism in quotes there because it's a pejorative most of the time, so when people say narrative, it's usually used to dismiss it, as opposed to narrative theory of history or constructivist theory of history or narrative constructivism. On my view, there's still significant work to be done in this area, and work that is unmistakably practice-oriented, and in that sense should be able to cater to the demands of even modern-day empiricists and the current sensibilities in theory of history, which are pushing towards something away from looking at texts and looking at historical writing as an artifact. The trending proposition that history could be studied without a sophisticated set of literary tools of textual analysis, to me, seems implausible. But that's the prevailing suggestion and direction in current debates, and it's the one that I hope to help counter. Still, a lot of colleagues have told me I'm fighting a fight which is over, so make up your own mind. But I think people representing textual or the linguistic term tradition, I was speaking with a colleague recently who's now 82, who was one of the ones in the 90s, very focused on this, noting how all the others have pretty much died out. So it's not a popular trend, but at the same time going on since Aristotle. Influence this attention on how we read, and it doesn't seem justifiable now just to forget about it. I should stick to the script. Before turning to any analysis of specific texts and how genre manifests in them, however, it's essential to investigate the concept of genre and the nature of genre commitments, something that needs to take place in part on a theoretical level. Arguably, as I said, this is an aspect that recent criticism of literary approaches to history writing so far largely overlooked. This strange oversight persists despite previous extensive literature and discussions surrounding the genre and reading commitments inherent in various types of referential texts. And that's a central topic of the Historia Fallida book. I admit that debates specifically within theory and philosophy of history as referential text in this context are less abundant than they should be. But I don't think that's any reason to say we shouldn't talk about it. I think, on the contrary, it underscores that we need to give matters some more consideration. So, some of my previous work bring these questions into the foreground, discussions within theory and philosophy. And what I'd like to do here is to briefly revisit several key approaches and central points. And I look forward to a discussion, sort of work through this. Despite that goal, my intention is not, however, simply to reiterate, hopefully to make this exploration more engaging. To that end, I'll try primarily to indicate connections with approaches and vocabularies not typically used in the so-called narrativist debate or tradition regarding history. And I hope just bringing those up will render the discussion more appealing and acceptable, even hopefully towards the critical so-called narrativist perspective. So to begin with, let's examine fundamental genre commitments of history. As I've already suggested, I don't want to focus on historians' self-professed beliefs or the profession's canonized objectives, which primarily, as you're all aware, revolve around truth-telling, empirical fidelity, and epistemic accuracy. A typical focus often overlooks the precise nature of the methodologies employed by historians, and it tends instead to broadly address facts and fidelity to these facts. It's what discussions mostly come back to when we talk about history. Regrettably, examinations of these issues rarely extend beyond emphasizing the significance of things like comprehensiveness, archival thoroughness, and sword criticism. That's history. I think it's fair to say it's the most defined methodology we have for history, or methodology component we have for history at all. And then when you get into subspecialties of different periods and different fields, then there's no adherence to history at all. So given the popularity of the notion of objectivity, often being replaced now with concepts like intersubjectivity, these debates have become more challenging to engage with. Let's say many strongly empirically minded thinkers seem to think that not using terms which have been criticized so intensely is enough to make them theoretically au fait. And importantly, while these discussions are internal to the discipline, they also, in defining the genre and in engaging and interpolating readers, specifically as readers of this kind of disciplined history, position us as complicit in a tacit agreement between the writer and the reader. So to me, what appears to be essential here is that aside from these basic relational commitments, there exists minimal consensus, or at least there's little clear articulation among historians about what exactly defines history as a discipline. I will make a number aside here. I don't know how it is here, but most universities I've been to or worked at, if students are lucky, there's usually one course by history, right? The rest is about the research side. Historians do is sadly neglected in most history departments. And there's this intuition that it happens automatically, which also transfers to the readers. That's what we expect somehow to be natural. So, what commonalities, other than these types of commitments to empiricism, to historians specializing in temporary pop music, people focus on estate inventories, probate, similar objects. There's very little historians. That's again something we try and investigate in that project. We've been interviewing historians, doing questionnaires. So before proceeding to the specific genre commitments, I want to introduce or make a crucial caveat. I think it's important to emphasize that none of what I say here, this narrativist program, intends to question the autonomy of history as a discipline, even if disciplinary rules and conventions often remain implicit and unstated, because there's no question that the role of historians' disciplinary commitments and their referential commitments do still define what counts as history. So I wanted to begin by discussing the fundamental aspects of history as a genre in its own right, specifically how history is by definition history. After that, I'll try to connect to the agreements and expectations which arise from genre choice between historians in terms of what I've usually referred to as the writer-reader pact. This is directly from Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of what is literature. It talks about the pact between the writer. It has some specific details to it, which we can also talk about, which I don't think I raise here, but this is inspired by his idea of a writer-reader pact in literature, and thinking about how that would work in the genre of history. So in addition to that, I'll try to indicate what might confidently be said about the nature of history as a distinct practice within the confines of that pact. And essentially, I'll simply be revisiting these ideas in more considered and explicit terms. So I've pretty much introduced what I'm going to talk about and what I talk about in Historia Fallida. Much of this is in there, but coming from a different angle, because I do try and bring it there from the point of view of what kind of unspecified, implicit prejudices we have about how we relate to the past in the language we use about speaking about the past. So, basic genre commitments. The key idea that I want here is that the inclusion of all significant available facts is imperative for a narrative to be recognized historical in terms of its genre. Obviously, a classic starting point for questioning history as a practice is to say we can't, so it's always going to be untrue if we get into that sort of back and forth between narrativists and empiricists on an exaggerated level. So we never expect anyone to include all the facts, but all the significant facts, and there's of course a big discussion about what makes facts significant to be included, and Reinhard Koselleck, I think, has the best answer to that. He talks about the veto power of facts, but any single fact can be used to veto an interpretation. If an interpretation is contradicted by a single fact, then that's already enough to say to us that we should reconsider that interpretation, but the opposite obviously isn't true. So we can have all the facts about what happens today in Santiago, and we still don't have any story of that. So it's always an imposition. But if there's something which is untrue in the story we tell, then we can rightfully, as historians, we can start vetoing that story. The question of the fact is also very complicated. Maybe we can discuss that later, because it's also very much a compromise between philosophers of language and then philosophers of history. In discussing history in a contemporary and relevant manner, the notion that facts don't possess a definitive constraining influence is untenable. And it's crucial to acknowledge that no serious propositions to the contrary are made from the constructivist or narrativist perspectives, even when they're in a very extreme form, like presented by Keith Jenkins. He still makes very clear that he believes in the compromise of facts, and he believes in reality, and then we just have to deal with the problems which are not only empirical, but also the ideological, political, ethical problems that stem from the fact that we have certain expectations about what history can do and what it does. And that's another point which is central to also to the book Historia Fallida. And it's also in, you mentioned the other book, which has come out with polynomial work of history, so in the first chapter of that.
Ahora la historia. Sí.
In that one, in the first chapter, I go over these questions about compromises relating to facts and so on in much more detail. Alongside the fundamental respect for the role and importance of facts in historical writing, definitions of the genre at the very least portray historians as truth-seeking. This implies that they don't embark on their scholarly pursuits with the intent to intentionally deceive readers. So the first claim, of course, is there's definitive genre of history, and this genre is predicated on commitment to work with facts and to engage with others' interpretations. And that's why it's so easy for the discipline to have changed from the idea of objectivity to intersubjectivity and not really change any of the practices, because it works very well under both terms. So historians strive to be truthful and truth-seeking to the best extent of their abilities. And of course, all of that seems exceedingly obvious when articulated one way. However, it's precisely that point that so many current proponents of the material terms or the empirical terms or post-narrativism in theory of history, theory and philosophical history try and contest. Defenders of ideas like presence or experience, I don't know how vogue they are here, they've been very vogue, I think, in the last 5-10 years in Europe. And the US, presence experience is turning to reality as it is, somehow. So defenders of those kinds of ideas often argue that so-called narrativists don't believe that history is in any way related to facts, or that historians can even refer to the past. Now, I use the word reference there, but it's a problematic word, so I don't want to put too much emphasis on that. As any philosopher of language would say, of course, referring to reality, but mostly. Anyway, this debate sometimes escalates to accusations not just of narrativism or relativism, but also of anti-realism. And that's now, once again, this debate has been going on specifically in relation to narrative theory of history. And again, this question of anti-realism has come up very forcefully. There's a new book out. Colleagues working in Norway called The Poverty of Anti-Realism, where they rehash all these debates and they start out saying, but constructivist, narrativist, and so on. So, again, reinstitute those very strong scarecrows that we've also been looking from the theory side, saying that historians are objectivist and the empirical and so on. And it really doesn't help the discussion. But both sides have very extreme, unrealistic representations of the other side. So this book on anti-realism, I wouldn't recommend it, but if one wants to see that side of the argument, it can be easily had from just the introduction. Okay, so what I'm doing now, italicized things at the beginning of some paragraphs. I just want to raise some points, just to emphasize them. So the first one is the relation. Reading, the idea is to continue fluently, but pay attention a little bit to the terminology in those italics, because they will build real references to some people mentioned. Ultimately, any genre economy of this kind is both mirrored and established in the contract which defines the encounter of the writer. This reading contract as an abstract concept can be envisioned as a writer-reader agreement or pact, shaping both the creation and consumption of any historical text. And it's only through proper recognition of the genre in its own right that the true function or intention of a text belonging to that genre can be made clear. And without this being a mutual pact, the genre doesn't exist, of course. And it's not necessarily explicitly stated, usually it isn't. For this reason, the genre agreement of the historical text must extend beyond just historians to incorporate readers, because we wouldn't want historians just writing readers. Historians need readers. Well, the one sort of state-sponsored, the others do. Again, perhaps stating something that sounds very obvious, but it's something which isn't in this discussion as an implicit. order to recognize the existence of that implicit contract, then we're not dealing with the text, I think, in appropriate context. Additionally, because this recognition of a genre is vital for understanding generic and specifically paratextual markers. Addition, because this recognition is vital for understanding, then generic and paratextual markers are needed, and they usually tend to be quite straightforward and evident if they're there, if it's unclear what it is. Most, I don't know now, when I was working in cultural history, most of the new books that came to the library all had a subtitle saying a cultural history of something else. Here, cultural history. And one of the examples I give now is also labeled in the subtitle, the history of. So we do have very clear paradigms. Many histories, especially if they're directed for a popular audience. When the paratextual genre markers are ambiguous, the reading contract is often perceived as having been violated. It's an interesting genre in its own right. We had a lovely talk Tuesday on Adolfo Ivan, colleague working at Princeton, called Graham Burnett, who has a fictional project. Super interesting. I recommend you look at it. It's called The Third Bird, I think it's called, which is related to work I've done over 20 years with fake histories and exhibitions and presentations and so on. And that's, I think, right now, extensive. So this kind that I've seen also in Rethinking History, we get a lot of what I call experiments with history. Very Burnett's focus. Where was I? Yeah, so if the reader doesn't know what to expect, and if they feel tricked or something, then this creates a very interesting situation. Okay, so I just want to briefly just to some related points, which I think have been neglected completely almost in the discussion surrounding narrative. First is the question of trust and plausibility. I already referred to that. So you're being tricked. Importantly, the aspects of the right to freedom, including any respect for freedoms, which is what Sartre emphasizes in modern literature as well, also highlight writing manifest what might be termed history outside history, or as I refer to another word, para-history, following him. I really like the term para-history, and hopefully I'll have a new book coming out also with Polynomials, that of para-history, where I try and understand. History outside history. Concept encompasses people's everyday historical sensibilities, their sense and understanding of their specific historicity, as well as their placement in a historical context, and always also in an interpretive framework. All of this runs parallel to academic history, so White's term para-history. And this framework connects us to the past and guides our future orientation in very complex and subtle ways. Largely neglected history. And the narrative challenge to it. Narrative is challenged to it. Narrative theory of history challenged to it. So before going further, I want to present the quote from Hayden White, just to defend that side of things, make a point that narrativism is not ignorant of that component of historicity, but it has very specific reasons for why it devoted so much attention to it. Instead, it's acutely aware of the context and historical embeddedness of the reading pact of the readers, in my opinion. And reading White closely, I think it's justified to say that. The key difficulty, I think, has confused some critics is that since White was focused on the practice of history writing, he preferred to explore historical situatedness and sense of historicity through close readings rather than philosophical generalizations, and through textual analysis rather than as fully theorized, articulated claims, also because he's an essayist. So he's not consecutive in the vocabulary he uses, methods he uses from one essay to the other, which makes it much harder to read. I would recommend this book. Text mentioned here, the historical text as literary artifact. I think that's the first reading of White. There's another essay which anyone who wants to understand White that's also reading the close readings. I would recommend him. There's a book called an essay called autobiography. I can't remember the precise title, but it's the context. No. Context in the form, I think it's about Henry Adams' autobiography. I think it's in wonderful reading where White does semiotic analysis of one specific book. And it's super useful to see how to do that kind of close reading and not try and read history as a source, but read it for the meaning which is implicit in the form and the way it's been written. So, the book which I have coming out, I try and do the same thing with a couple of films and a couple of novels and stuff. But that essay from White, I think it's called The Context in the Form. I think it's in Content of the Form. But this, also the historical text is literary artifact. That's the best introduction to his basic arguments. And in that book, he says, the historian shares with his audience general notions of the forms that significant human situations must take by virtue of his participation in the specific processes of sense-making, which identify him as a member of the cultural endowment rather than. So that's very general. The question of how these concepts manifest in detail is an important one. Specifically, how do cultural endowments and general forms or notions recognize the humanistic universalist ideal, at least in White's work, which makes up a problematic. Further, the idea of cultural endowments and discursive context to more specific social practices and significant debates in social philosophy, societal philosophy, social philosophy. Should be one comment. The question, how should we go about connecting to debates about the interaction between cultural heritage, social discourse, societal discourse, and individual human experience? Now, White only hints at these because he's so intent on making his one point really about the content and the form, and the fact that we have to understand history for its literary qualities as well, history writing. And he doesn't get into all that, but he's informed by a huge literature of his contemporaries, and especially I think in the late 70s, early 80s, and just quickly, and also mid-90s. I'm quickly going to, again, with these paragraphs, pointing to some of those discussions, because they just haven't been brought into that narrativist debate, even though people say we finished with that debate, it's not important, but at the same time, all the connections that should have been made are still unmade. Either worth investigating, if we want to think of history as an artifact which has societal, ethical, ideological, political function as well, which I think is hard to deny. So, dynamics of identity. In Historia Fallida, last chapter is a little chapter on identity, looking at some of these same theories. The purpose of presenting a specific citation from White is to underscore that historicity, broadly understood, and the societal applications will be effectively using the same tools that we use to tackle history texts. The focus of narrativists on history writing should not, in my mind, be misconstrued as a curtailing of this mode of thought solely to profession. And I want to mention, I think there's a lot of wonderful examples to illustrate the effectiveness of reading in this way. But I think one of the best ones is in Judith Butler's excitable speech when she's analyzing Supreme Court pronouncements. I think it's hurtful language. I can't remember what term she uses. The book is all about representational violence, and they're trying to define what kind of language is appropriate and whatnot. It's a very impressive analysis. And this kind of analysis is particularly capable, I think, in charting the practices of interpolation and identity formation, practices which are so central to what history does to us, to how history as a societal discourse directs and makes use of us as humans, makes use of us. And for those who are interested in history does to us, there are two wonderful history were always neglected. I think Martin Davis right about how neoliberalism are seen so important part of that position as an apparatus being funded by the state and so on. Keith Jenkins also has some arguments for that, but he's not so forceful in going in that direction, especially a book by Martin Davis called Historics. I think is worth looking up if you're interested in that. Okay, so next one, the idea of discursive implication. Well, similar discussions are present in speech. Hasn't really been brought as Mariana Greca in Buenos Aires, who has done some work on it, but very little. So while similar discussions are present, the scope of theoretical exploration, I think, extends far beyond that. Free to white, also so rigid, proposed by Austin, necessary for analyzing interpolation or discursive implication, but at the same time is very useful for getting into that discourse, even though he has fairly strict categories and ideas of how we should deal with those things. A very good reading of Austin is by Stanley Fish. For those again interested in following his upstanding reading of Austin as well as Derrida, how relativism works in a sort of not only in relation to history, but also in relation to legal texts and other forms of referential discourse. Anyway, a fundamental takeaway from all these approaches might, I think, be the simple recognition that we're all entwined in collective processes of meaning making. Obvious, but again, forget that when we talk about histories. These processes manifest in various discursive positions we assume and hold in everyday life, in societal interactions, and in academic discourses practice. Positioned and linguistically affected interpolation. So moving beyond White and Austin, we also encounter discussion of identity politics from the 1980s, 1990s. Again, something which has been pretty much completely neglected in philosophy and theory of history. And the prominent figures you all know, Judith Butler, Iris Marion Young, Gayatri Spivak, Nancy Fraser. In my view, the concept of interpolation, especially in the Althusserian form, still remains one of the most promising frameworks for considering especially the ethical and political issues. Again, history as interpolation has really been theoretically precisely addressed only by Martin Davis and Sandy Cohen on a sort of more extensive scale. So, for me, it's essential to consider how history frequently functions as a societal agent, interpolating us as specific types of subjects within various discourses. So a lot of that has been done after Gayatri Spivak, also in post-colonial studies and other fields, but not specifically again to do with history writing most of the time. I talk about a lot of these things in the last chapter of Historia Fallida and in the context of the thinkers mentioned. And I also lean a lot on Richard Rorty there. Rorty to me is useful that he's bridging between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy or pragmatism to some extent. And situates himself in a very complex way as a postmodernist pragmatist philosophy. So he brings a lot of useful definitions to the discussions, which I try and use in the final chapter. However, it's important to note that many contemporary discussions have evolved beyond these mainly 1990s perspectives and even beyond someone like Nancy Fraser, who continues to work on them now. There are a lot more nuanced interpretations, but at the same time, they don't speak to these discussions. So I think it's something like looking into intersectionality, for example, is very useful, very worthwhile, but it should be related to the other discussion about identity politics. So my motivation with all this is just to briefly note some of the aspects which I believe are still largely overlooked in theory and philosophy, which would be crucial both for a deeper understanding of narrativism as well as for understanding the place of historical discourse in the world, as it were. So for me, there's the There's potential value in reintroducing these concepts, allowing them now to easily deemed old issues addressed by narrativists to be appreciated in their perhaps more mainstream philosophical contexts, and also to bring back a lot of these other largely neglected or now old-seeming discussions, which haven't been followed through. They might then be perceived as only marginally different from current, avowedly innovative interventions within theory and philosophy of history. And I have to say, I do find it remarkable how so many concepts are being reinvented to different terms. And that really frustrates me. And I said at the beginning, it's particularly marked in object-oriented ontology and post-narrativist approach to history. I don't know how much you've come across it. It's been very forcefully. And I think they've overlooked a lot of critical discussions. So my general sense is that looking closer into the interactions between textual approaches and current practices of history could be highly beneficial, and also practice-based investigations. And of course, you have the whole, I'm going to skip a little bit because I feel I'm talking too much. You have the whole A network theory camera. Could be drawn, which just haven't come to these discussions, so there's a lot of room for deepening from that sort of stereotypical idea about narrative. Okay, so for me, the important thing would be to begin, if we start doing this kind of work, to begin with thorough examination of meaning processes and commitments, meaning-making processes and commitments employed in a specific context, looking at specific texts. I skipped a few lines. And it would seem that such an analysis cannot be effectively conducted without utilizing sophisticated tools of discourse analysis and acknowledging what Elizabeth Omar has extremely usefully, I think, termed our fundamental discursive condition. I hope you're familiar with Elizabeth Omar's work. It's also worth looking. This discursive condition is essential for any process of meaning-making, understanding, interpretation, and so on, obviously. And without in-depth attention to discursive contexts, any analysis of historical research and writing is too superficial to yield meaningful insights or understanding. And again, I refer you to Headwind's biography, autobiography of Henry Adams. So rather than going on elaborating that particular, I wanted to look at a couple of texts as well. So as I say here, because I don't think it's useful to discuss history as a genre simply on the basis of theory, but also looking at some action texts and the aspects which constrain us in our reading. I have two sample texts, one literary, the other historical, just to highlight how blurred and undefined the genre boundaries of this wholly historical work actually can be. And I hope that we might be able to discuss some of these things. I think that'll be more interesting for everyone. So the first text, I think many of you are familiar with this book, Lincoln in Nevada, with George Saunders. It's about 6 years old. Saunders characterizes the novel as ostensibly historical, yet it's framed as a supernatural, or within a supernatural setting. As such, it's simultaneously labeled both historical fiction and magical realism. This dual categorization is not much there today, as one might think, but it does raise doubts about whether it should be considered of a historical fiction, if there is such a thing as historical fiction. We do tend to set those kinds of expectations and agreements. So I would say a lot of people think there's a proper form of historical fiction. Like the Count of Monte Cristo is a common example. Saunders is very different, of course. Presented as a fictional novel, the typical concerns of historical accuracy, of course, don't apply, although there's still a useful consideration for genre definition. But this doesn't mean that the can't be critiqued based on societal or political sensibilities, which we always do. But as specifically as historical fiction, it isn't bound by the same right to read a pact, obviously, as a text of history. And there's usually surrounding us, as with surrounding Saunders' work, there was a lot of objections to how it was done. Historical accuracies were pointed out. People had personal reasons for dislike, aesthetic reasons, logical reasons, and so on. And given that it's situating itself correctly in the genre, it shouldn't be a critique of the text, but it's still meant by many readers. But historical accuracy should not be correct. See a lot with historical films and become historically minded people will point out to every detail. So, even non-historical films like a lot of Rings, for example, people will say this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And it's the way we tend to receive things, even when we have a good understanding of the contract between the reader and the writer. Okay. Considering all that, you might ask why Lincoln in the Bardo. I think the book is made particularly intriguing for the discussion that I hope we can have by Saunders' technique of cutting and pasting from actual historical sources. Notably, he quotes and references which sources accurately, mimicking the process historians often employ in their scholarly work. However, Saunders also invents some presented sources, blurring the line between historical accuracy and fiction. This approach creates uncertainty even for historically informed reader, as it's never clear when the narrative shifts from history to the fiction. I think we could go to the. Oh, thank you for putting the. I forgot to say about the head. So, should we first page? You make the whole previous page, not this one. Previous. Yeah. Okay. So here. So he has the way Saunders uses is real and imagined references is what makes the writer, as a consequence of that, the right to read a pact in his work, in the reception of his work, becomes somewhat fragile, especially for those readers who approach the book with the intent also gaining historical insights. So I'm just going to show you two books of this, two pages from the book. Just so you see that specific blending of fact and fiction and its impact on reader perceptions. The way the reader-writer pact is actualized. That's the intention anyway. So on the first page I have here, everything seems as though it could be derived from actual historical accounts about Lincoln and his close associates. Language, while prosaic and unacademic, is not distinctly different from that we find in many typical history texts focused on someone like Lincoln, and particularly so in older works of these. Could be excerpts from all the work. I didn't check which one are real and which not, so I will leave that to anyone who's interested. Notably, all the excerpts on this first page I'm showing you are referenced in a way that lends them an air of credibility and authenticity. Looking more closely, we can see that the descriptions include details which are unlikely to have been accessible to historians without contemporary testimony, but of course, they also suggest that they would have had contemporary accounts and testimony in formulating his narrative, so it's hard again to say. And even at the time, at times aggressively evocative style of writing aligns with what is or was, at least at the time, acceptable for historical narrative. So again, it's hard to say how that process is from an empiricist approach. This includes elements which evoke emotions and sentiments. You see the wild things of spirits, but it's again within the limits of historical prose, that context. And depending on the specific writer-reader pact, it's still relatively standard and doesn't need to conflict with historical context. And the reader of that page and others similar to it in Saunders' work could understandably take it to be a form of experimental history. We're just presenting the sources as they are with minimum authorial intervention, just compiling citation to the proper records. And that's, of course, something you'll see also classic of that kind of approach, I think, is a book by Michel Foucault and Alain Fage, what is it, families where they just have the documents and they don't intervene at all, or by Natalie's even there's fiction in the archives, which separates the archival part and which has the small interventions, separately noted in different fonts, just to read out, but also not to share interpretation. So this could very well be taken from that kind of experimental history. And it could be seen then as experimental history texts or alternative history texts, work by Graham D. Burnett that I mentioned, as a challenge to traditional history writing, and just offering fresh directions for historians where to go when they present and interpret the narratives. The benefit that's often argued to come from this is that theoretical element is that it could draw for engagement from readers and make a text more impactful. The argument that I try and make in the book is that also when you push meaning-making processes onto the readers, then you also leave out a lot of the implicit next page is very different. Actually, reading the book are in the bardo of the liminal space of Buddhism, I understand. And they're focusing on events which unfold around them. Dialogue. They're sort of quotes which sound like eyewitness testimony, but it's because we know they're ghosts. We already know that it's fictional in that sense, but it's partly fictional. Very few historians would include this ha exchange in a history. Present sources, like a conventional source book, for example, an archival source book. So such a narrative device could, I think, be found in experimental history writing. I refer you to Jim Goodman's Blackout, which is just little glimpse. I think it's not useful. The purpose of this kind of writing, of course, is not to convey information, but to create a specific atmosphere. And in this case, the atmosphere is overtly supernatural and imaginary, and it distinctly deviates from the typical genre conventions of any historical text. So for most contemporary readers, that would make a genre eminently clear. At the same time, when we look at some experimental texts, they do this, and they still get, like Jim Goodman, the Pulitzer for history. Those books are still acceptable to a certain segment. I specifically wanted to give the example of Lincoln in the Bardo, just to highlight the point I make in Historia Fallida, which is that there's no inherent natural to the form history writing can take. This is something where a lot of prejudices, especially by historians, by professional historians, come in, because we've been brought up to think the formation brings us to think that the classic realist form is what we should all be doing, aspiring to. But theoretically, there's no reason to exclude these kinds of experimental strategies from history writing, provided that we can keep that genre in constant motion also, so it evolves to a point where readers are prepared to engage with these kinds of texts as intended. And in chapter 2 of the book, I try and explain in more detail why such experimentation can be beneficial. The idea is that it urges readers to be more conscious of their role, their personal role in assigning meanings to their readings. Again, so we're not pushing ideology, pushing ethical, political expectations on them. So readers should focus on how their interpretations manifest ethical, political, and ideological. They ought, from this position, advocating experimental history, they ought to be aware, intentional in adopting these ideological stances, political stances, and so on, instead of deriving them uncritically from the historical text. And I think that's the idea which situates narrativist, constructivist discussions very firmly in a post-structuralist tradition, because this idea, or essentialist post-structuralist tradition, because this idea of ethical choice and decisionism is really only there in analytic situated ethics, where this aspect is so strongly put forward. But okay, I'm done. Sorry. So, particularly in narrativist readings, ethical and political responsibility are viewed, in my opinion, more easily concealed, as well as missed in texts which adopt a classic realist form. The likelihood of uncritical perspectives is higher with such realist narratives than it is with experimental forms, which find greater reader engagement and more meaning creative. And I advocate for it in the book, and to me it's important because it emphasizes the centrality of active readership in shaping historical understanding. I think really in the discussion we've had so far in theory and philosophy of history, there's still very little discussion about readership and readers and how they're positioned by the text and what the expectations are. And I recognize that some of this kind of form might seem far-fetched, but again, perception, I think it largely hinges on current conception of what constitutes a standard or even an ideal history text. And I think for most of us, I'm doing it differently here, but a history text acceptable. With Tuesday, in addition to D. Graham Burnett, we had Ethan Kleinberg, who's written a book on and he was telling us that he had a lot of difficulty with publishers to accept this idea of having two parallel columns because it might not be received in the right way as a serious philosophy text or history text. So again, it's still the expectations for what history should look like are very strong. So one part of those expectations is that when engaging with historical texts, within the epistemologically grounded, of course it should, to be history, but at the same time, there's an anticipation or expectation also that because it's epistemologically grounded and constructed upon a certain foundation in that sense, carefully, then we should be able to read back all that groundedness, all that empirical stuff, also as readers, the easy way. So part of the idea of a contract is that there's mutual trust on both sides, but at the same time, there's also the expectation for history text to be serious. We have to be able to read it also all that empirical side of things, not just the historian saying history, or at least it has to. Not the language in the presentation shouldn't diverge too far from that empiricist idea, and that's again reflected back in the idea or the ideal of the classic realist form, because there it's easier to keep that connection than it is in these kinds of experimental forms. So this intuition, the expectation of a solid epistemic foundation in historical texts, undeniably plays a central role in the work of some recent post-narrativists who advance that we can separate argumentative as well as the foundation by this aspects of the text. Somehow separate those two from each other, but also separate them from rhetorical elements of history. intertwining of these. What it is. Some highlighted this, but I just wanted you to, you can't see this, of course, I wasn't thinking. Can you make it bigger just there in the middle? Over corner. So this is there's a book by Arthur Marwick, who was one of the people who had the biggest spats with Aidan White and Keith Jenkins and all the others, trying to say that we can't have this kind of histories that they advocate, where everything isn't very clear, very empirically grounded and so on, empirically grounded. But then later on, he wrote a book called It, A History of Human Beauty. So already the topic is taking him quite far away from more conservative histories. Sorry, it's a page after.
Yeah.
It's also not so important this specific work. Yeah. So he's talking about Betty Davis. The indented quotation here on this page. The argument he makes about Betty Davis says her sympathetic biographer Charles Hyden makes the point by she was had an accident, which was part of why she was beautiful, which is why half her career. The fact that he makes the point by ambition, and then everything he gives is the quote he gives is very poetic, but also he draws an argument out about actually having been an argument. Also, it's going very far from, let's say, it's going very far into the interpretation. And to me, at least, I mean, we can also look at some descriptions on the previous page if we want to discuss this. I won't bother with it now, but with this kind of language, as far as I can see, there's no difference to Saunders' example, the first page at least. Even the ghostly characterizations, I think, they're all very much the same as his voice, as Marwick's voice here. And yet it comes from a respected and established history text. Now, I'm just showing this example to demonstrate that even challenging potential innovations in historical form might not be as radical as we might assume, because this is one of the hardcore British historians. And his language is completely troped, completely metaphor. There's a lot of space, linguistic space, meaning making space open there. There's a couple of things I might discuss if we want to get into this on the other page, but let's do that if we have a discussion. So what I want to suggest briefly with this is that even readers of what can be considered conventional histories are quite capable already, and that the existing reading contract we have is not as restrictive as in theory debates we often assume. So history should look a certain way. It should have an increasing space and so on. We look at actual history texts, they don't function in the way that theorists who promote an empiricist attitude to text or a post-narrativist attitude would wish they do for their arguments to be true. Let's put it that way. So this resemblance between different kinds of texts highlights the fluidity and adaptability of historical narrative forms, I think, and I'm sure we can find much better examples. But in doing so, it challenges the perceived rigidity of each genre conventions. Also, in that sense, undermines quite a lot of the arguments which are based on them. And I do claim that this example is not isolated or particularly extreme, even in mainstream history. And I'm sure any of you can find similar instances or recall similar instances which aren't yet in the arena of experimental histories. And this underscores the prevalence of diverse narrative techniques even within mainstream historical texts, suggesting a broader acceptance and potential for varying historical writing. Exaggerated or stereotyping too much. So a pertinent question to me then is what distinguishes revisionism these various texts apart from their paratextual markers and the sanction of the historical institution? When that question has come up in previous debates, there's often been a lot of outrage at the suggestion that proponents of textual readings don't believe history to be true, or that they claim that texts don't refer to external particularities, or this whole thing about history as fiction, and get into the debate about history as fiction or not, and there are no other alternatives all the time in that debate. And it's been an unfruitful debate for 50 years, so in the book, and what I want to do here as well is to steer clear of that debate and hopefully indicate some other options of looking at these things. So I hope we could instead concentrate on the reality of paratextual and societal conventions which undergo history texts, try and read them back from the texts. That's because texts I think fruit-fetch mechanisms, and reading any text in a constrained manner, focusing exclusively on its content or its argument, for instance, without attempting to map it to specific reading conventions. So when we engage in textual discursive analysis, we're inherently reading back limitations, expectations, and interactions which the text embodies, and which the author has grappled with. And again, I refer everyone to that text by him, right, on Henry Adams' autobiography. I think looking at texts in this way highlights what should be obvious, the inseparability of the writer, the context, and the reader in the construction of historical understanding. But it's, even though it seems so obvious, it's something which just hasn't been. It's a debate which hasn't been had in philosophy. Okay, I just complain about those. Finally, and to conclude, one key indicator of the text genre, particularly in the context of truthfulness and inclusiveness, is reference. That part is obvious. I think that makes that historical texts struggle to achieve the same kind of textual coherence, which we often find in what we classify as classic or work-like texts, work-like fiction, or artworks, because of that commitment to use referential material. And this discrepancy means that historical texts can be aesthetically impaired or disturbed. And that also, I think, can be read back from a lot of history. And of course, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Lenin. It invited us to think about our role as historians, both in the disciplinary and social and political dimensions. Now, the audience will ask you some questions related to your paper and book. However, before that, I will briefly explain to the audience the format of this part of the conference. So please give me a second. Muchas gracias nuevamente por la asistencia. A continuación les voy a explicar muy brevemente el formato de lo que resta de la sesión. Ya, como núcleo tenemos algunas preguntas preparadas. Sin embargo, si alguno de ustedes tiene alguna pregunta en consideración, por favor, siéntanse libres de levantar la mano y participar. Ya, para tranquilidad de ustedes, contamos con el apoyo de dos de las académicas del núcleo, la profesora María Luisa Fernández, la profesora Camila Gatica, quienes van a ser traductoras. Así que, desde ya, si alguno tiene una pregunta y la quiere hacer en español, no hay ningún problema, ellos van a traducir la pregunta acá al profesor Pihlainen. ¿Ya? De lo contrario, si alguno por ahí se aleona y quiere hacer la pregunta en inglés, también siéntanse en libertad de acción. Así que, bueno, quisiera saber si alguno tiene alguna pregunta en español o en inglés que realizar. ¿Ya? Sí, aquí, compañero.
Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias. Leí la traducción porque igual me costó un poco entender el audio, pero me parece muy interesante esta relación que tú haces, porque una vez leí, no me acuerdo en qué libro, hace ya como 10 años, que el mismo argumento racista, el mismo argumento fascista, pero hecho por algo que se autodenomine centro de estudios de lo que sea, versus otra cosa que simplemente sea un grupo neofascista, va a ser tomado muy diferente, porque está expresado de una forma diferente, porque tiene una estructura diferente. Entonces, aquí vemos la historia como algo más serio si tiene una estructura más seria. Y por eso esta historia de Lincoln y el bardo es como los bufones, o es como las sátiras, que por su exageración nos permiten ver, hay algo aquí que parece que no es correcto, y nos hacen dudar al tiro de este lazo que tenemos con el autor, de este compromiso de autor-lector. Entonces, ¿cómo crees tú que puede aplicarse esto? El analizar el texto de la forma que está construida, la forma de cómo están hechas las narrativas, para identificar las falacias que hoy en día están súper fuertes en el mundo, sobre todo con el ascenso de las ultraderechas en Europa y en América Latina.
I think it would be safer. I feel like I understood the question, but I think it would be good.
Essentially, when he asked, he did a whole introduction on the format of the text and how like ultra-right ideas expressed in a more formal and academic way sometimes they don't cause the stir that a more informal way would do of the same ideas. And then he moved on to ask about structure, basically, how the text, la estructura del texto, ¿cierto? The structure of the text, and ¿puedes repetir la última parte de la pregunta? La pregunta final, en fondo, no.
¿Cómo nos puede servir el análisis de la estructura y la forma que está narrado para identificar las falacias más fácil?
So what he's asking is about the fallacies of the text and how the analysis of the structure can help to identify those fallacies.
Thank you.
That's
Hay dos, ya hay una acá. Yo voy a hacer algo que la estructura porque acumular información es muy difícil, entonces voy a parar y voy a hacer análisis.
Hello, my question is, what happened with the academic who not and create that vision, general vision, with the audience? Because I see one of the big problems of the actual history teachers in the classroom, because I work in a college, was the titles for the pandemic don't have these general visions because they lose 2 or 3 years in the house and don't learn how the essential of some material things, how we can connect the academic with the audience when they don't have the common visions. No, it's about the
the role, or if the historians, such as this our job, have some moral or ethic compromise on the way we write, because of we're faced against this dichotomy. I think it's dichotomy. We either write something that it's for public disclosure, for general public, or something about a specific target, such as historians. If we write for general public, we tend to do it in a more light way, right? But that can mean to decrease our level of rigorosity, historical rigor, the public. So if that it's the when we are faced against that, how should we approach the problem of writing in order to avoid being misleading on our text or investigations, to avoid evitar como create fake narratives on what we're studying. Like it has to do with the previous question about the essence of ultra-right narratives, which tend to take on this light, ligeramente argumental, like argumented narratives. So essentially, is that how we approach the writing in order to avoid those narratives that can be harmful in expressing investigations and general research of history.
¿Una otra pregunta?
In the first place, thanks, Kalle, for your conference. But when I heard your presentation, you say two things: the contextualist and the proposal of Austin, the linguistic term. Can you defend the relation between the proposal of Quentin Skinner School of Cambridge and the narrativism of Hayden White?
Yes.
Hola.
Okay, well, thank you. Very big question. Big question. To go about them. I wish I knew the answers. Let's try. Let's try and go in order. So, underlying question that relates to all three first questions, which is that, sadly, I think simple propagandistic form is more effective most of the time than complex form. And it's not, I think, to do with empirical issues, but it's to do with just getting the message across. So for those of us who would like to advocate complex narratives, experimental narratives, literary narratives, histories, it's for readers who are capable enough to take responsibility for their choices, let's say, for their decisions, for what they're doing. So it's an ideal in a way, where we'd have readers who will take, in a Derridean sense or a Cartesian sense, make the decisions and take responsibility for what their actions are. Each time they make a decision, each time they do an action, there's this very strong expectation on an ideal level of personal responsibility, personal ethical responsibility, and that's ideally that's what reception of complex narratives will do. But at the same time, if we want to reach people, the populace, if we want to inspire people, move people, then a simple narrative is usually the thing that works. And this is the problem, I think, in advocating any kind of nuanced thinking at all, and especially saying we should put responsibility more into individuals, because it doesn't function in the real world. Most of the time, it doesn't function with political questions, with political movements, and so on. So it's very complex. I don't see a solution to political issues in this kind of discussion. I think it's relevant for texts and subject matters and writers. We don't read histories to understand what we should do tomorrow. Histories to negotiate ourselves in the daily work. That kind of level of complex understanding about anything when we do our grocery shopping. We decide how to create it. And Keith Jenkins, I think, has in his sort of push of experimental histories and trying to suggest oppositional histories, he finally just says we don't need history at all because we have so many other imaginaries, we call them other imaginaries, like philosophy, like literature, and so on, to help us orient ourselves in the world ethically, ideologically, and so on, that we don't need history for that. And of course, you have specific, I mean, especially this year here, you have a lot of reason to think about the weight of history, but at the same time, most of the time, knowledge about the past doesn't help us decide how to do things in the present. So I'd separate those discussions, just to begin with. It's slightly controversial, I think, to make that claim, which is why a lot of narrativists are, why a lot of our theory is rejected by historians, because it's based on this idea that however much we know about the world, we don't have any ethical guidance from that. It's the old Humean argument that there's no bridge from what is to what ought to be. So however much we know about the world, we still don't have anything except ourselves to decide what we think the world should be like. So again, this is what post-structuralists, what existentialists like Sartre sort of crystallizing that idea of the aporia, the undecidable decision, where we have to just stop and make our decision knowing we don't have any grounds for making that decision. So again, that's the ethical side of things, but when it comes to the practical political side of things, that's not, of course, how we work as humans. We get motivated by narratives, motivated by slogans, motivated by propaganda, and we function in a very different way. So again, moving from theory to practice is very hard issue. But that idea of having no entailment from reality to values, I think, is a fundamental aspect which we should understand when we're looking also at fake news, political discourse, which is based on falsifications and so on, because there's no reason to expect whether something is true or fake. It should motivate us to a certain ethical, ideological, political conclusion. So sort of making that decision. But this is all very general, and I'm going to try and be a little bit more specific, because your question was specifically about the structure of the text and how that structure of the text would help us spot fallacies. I don't think, to me, it doesn't work that way. So what we can Here I mentioned from Reinhard Koselleck is that for a referential text, he's speaking about history text, but I think it applies to all referential texts. It's very easy to falsify referential texts if we have a fact which doesn't agree with that interpretation. And again, going back to that general idea of entailment from reality to interpretation, from reality to meaning, or from reality to value, and however many facts we have about something, it still doesn't give us that interpretation. That interpretation is always offered by someone. So whatever facts we have, they can't move us toward an interpretation, but a single fact can sort of disqualify an interpretation. Because it's the logic works the same way as in sort of utilizing causal theory, which I think a lot of historians are trained to think that causal theory, causal connections also have an interpretive, explanatory function, but they also only have an interpretive, explanatory function forward, because you have a causal chain, and it's sort of always breaking up like this. So you can't trace it backward. You can only trace causality forward in a way. Tracing it backward makes no sense, because we can take something like this, and we can say this is, we can trace this causally back to the first time a human used fire to melt metal, or to the Big Bang, or to whatever, and it doesn't have any explanatory value. But going forward, it does. So same thing happens when you're moving from facts to interpretations. It works one way. Falsification way in this case, but not the other way, because again, it spreads out. So I think with false narratives, with the fallacies of narratives, the thing that historians do best, conventional historians do best, is the archival work, the research work, and the study work. So I think that's the sort of strength that historians have to address these kinds of things, because historians are very good at establishing individual facts. And if you're in a situation where you can have a proper conversation, so both sides are willing to engage, then it's still possible to point to individual facts which can disqualify interpretation. I think that's the strength we have against political sort of abuse of narratives and so on. We can still, in a reasonable environment where both sides are talking to each other, we can still point to facts which disqualify certain interpretations. And this is in the debate about revisionist histories in Europe, the revisionist histories of the Holocaust, for example. It's been fairly easy to dismiss the ones which are fictional, in that sense that they're not based sufficiently on facts, but it's been very hard then to dismiss the ones which use all the facts and just sort of twist the interpretations, twist the meanings, and try and be useful in representing things in a different way. And that sort of misrepresentation doesn't happen on the level of facts, it happens on the level of ethical, ideological, and sort of interpretive. So I think it's, yeah, I mean, historians are really good, which Hayden might never mention because you're looking at history writing. Most of us don't mention. Historians are really good at establishing facts. And this is something which they don't get enough credit for in these debates. It's what most of the training goes towards as well. So I don't think I can say more about that, but these are all interrelated. The question of, again, it relates to all the first three questions. Connecting with the audience, I think it's a really complicated question, because proper academic histories, I think the readership will be very small. And then you have like bestseller histories, and history is still one of the best-selling nonfiction. At least in the US, when I looked at the numbers, it's still the best-selling form of nonfiction. It's history, and it's almost like literary bestsellers. So that has a strong connection to the audience, but I think for proper academic historians to connect with audiences, it's really hard. And the ones I've seen, well, they're also somewhat popular. I mean, you have really good examples of people like Natalie Seaman Davis, who gets to do a film from her book, Robert Rosenstone, who gets to do reads from a book he wrote as a serious historian, and then suddenly he's in Hollywood producing a film, helping to make sure the film is historically accurate and so on, which is what's demanded. But as I said at the beginning, I think I said, or somewhere early on, that at least for the universities I've worked at, there's really no, if we're lucky, there's one course in history writing, and it's more about sort of writing realistically than connecting with the audience. It's not really about trying to make it better, it's just trying to make it sort of academic writing. So again, there's this, I think, whole process of trying to alienate historians from the audience in the formation of it. But there was something else to your question I wanted to ask, if I'm missing something, because
I see one of the problems. It's and for people, for the how it's happened.
That's a very good point, because for the discussion that I'm engaged in, it's a good question which hasn't been in this discussion, because everyone's speaking within that coherent, homogeneous group, the same kind of readers as they're writing across those boundaries. I really don't know. I think the classic Enlightenment answers are, of course, to just understand each other. So we go to Habermas or someone the same idea of ideal communication, removing our expectations, but it really hasn't entered this discussion at all. And I think it should be important to take it into account, but I haven't thought about it. I hate to think of myself as defending Enlightenment ideals, but they always go back to education when these kinds of questions come up. We just need more education. And I suppose that is the solution. I lost my notes. Question. I don't. Yeah, to your question, it's the same I already touched on, I think. I'm sorry, it wasn't your question. No question was the last one. There. Sorry, yes. Sorry, I got the wrong one. It's back to the same thing I started out with. Right? Propaganda is more effective. It's much easier to get across. And I'm not sure about distinction between easy narratives and complex narratives, or propaganda and academic history. Again, like in the first comments, I'm not sure it's related to academic rigor necessarily. I think you can make effective propaganda without the negative connotations by being academic as well, but then you're not appealing to certain types of prejudices and stereotypes in the same way. So I think they're different things. Empirical, rhetorical, I think they function together as tropes. Propaganda is much simpler. It doesn't present all the details, but there's no reason why there's a difference in the referentiality of it, or in the rigor, the truthfulness of it. And then when you go back to the issue of fake narratives of that kind of propaganda, I think it's easy to, not easy, it depends on the audience again, but if we're having an open discussion where everyone's willing to understand that it's possible to question those interpretations in a fairly neutral way in the public realm. Of course, in the media and so on, it's impossible right now in most countries. I have no ideas about how we go about that. Yeah. And then, yeah. Let's get ahead and like, it's a really interesting article, I think, by Martin J., where he talks about the missed connection between Skinner and White. And I think that's worth looking at, but I really don't have. I don't see them as speaking about the same thing at all. So I didn't even find that article so interesting, because I think White's doing something completely different. He's only really trying to talk about what historians do when they write, not about the interpretive side, not about the research side and so on. And the idea behind that kind of conceptual history, I think, is more to help us understand about the past. And White at the very beginning of what he does, he says he's distinguishing the research phase, he says, from the writing phase. And this is what the others like Frank Ankersmith and Keith Jenkins also do. And then they say we're only going to look at the writing phase because that hasn't really been investigated on. So they're really only looking at the historical text. And that's, I think, the thing that's most often missed when people start criticizing them, or their critics attack them. They think that they're talking about relativism also in this idea of establishing facts. And that's since we're on the topic, I might say a few words about that, because in these debates, they all make also Ankersmith, White, Jenkins, they all make a compromise, which is not a sustainable compromise philosophically, but it's a very useful compromise for philosophy of history, which is that we can satisfactorily present singular existential statements about the world. So we can say something like, so and so happened on such a day, and see that as completely unproblematic. And they accept historians' research work as capable, and they say historians also capable of producing singular existential statements. Now, for a philosopher of language, that would be a problematic thing, because you have all the questions about reference, all the questions about how any linguistic shaping already starts to form things, but they make this compromise so that they can then talk about philosophy of history and do theory of history, because if you can't establish singular facts, then you can't talk about what historians are doing, because that's the premise of what they're doing. They have facts about the past, which they then use to build interpretations. So I think that's an important thing to understand about narrativism, is that they make a very difficult philosophical compromise just to be able to talk about what they're doing wrong, and then they focus on what happens in the writing itself after that first stage. And yeah, it's the only way to do theory in philosophy of history, I think, but it's still not a sustainable starting point in my philosophy.
Thank you very much. Well, because of time, we are not going to ask you more questions, but thank you very much. Very interesting questions of the audience. So, así damos por finalizar la sesión de lo que fue la última sesión del año del núcleo. Bueno, junto con invitarlos, como siempre decimos, a que nos sigan por nuestras diversas redes sociales y plataformas. Los espera, bueno, o lo que queda del COVID, eso, que tengan un muy buen